Welcome to Inside the Director Circle. I'm Jason Langford-Brown, your host, founder of the Director Circle and practicing business advisor and coaching psychologist. Over the next two episodes, we're going to focus on highly effective communication, obviously a must for any leader. In the next episode, we're going to bust some myths around this subject, but today we're going to put a spotlight on the missing link, or maybe until now, a newly created AQ or answer intelligence. As ever, we're going to have some people joining us, and delighted that today our knowledge partner from the Director Circle is Dr. Brian Klabowski, Professor of the University of Chicago and creator of AQ or Answer Intelligence. And as ever, to put a practical element to this, we've got a couple of our Director Circle members, a heavyweight, not literally, but from the industry of steel, Gemma Steadman, who's one of the divisional directors of the Hadley Group, one of the UK's leading manufacturers of roll-form products, actually now a very global business and moving into new markets like modular housing. And Gemma's got a great background in large commercial sales leadership, so I'm sure she'll have a lot to add to the conversation. And alongside her, we've got Jaqueline Watson, marketing director of Henderson, Loggie, one of Scotland's leading accountancy and advisory firms. So before we get into this, just very quickly, just to remind you that this is just a snapshot of what happens inside the Director Circle. So if you want to get more involved in the community, just log on to directors-circle.com and click join the community button. So just to get into this conversation of highly effective communication, I think traditionally for us, when we talk about communication with clients, there's always the question of questioning. There's the debate that if we ask better questions, then communication is better and deeper. That often extends into listening, the need to listen deeply, and when we extend into that, we get into things like body language, which obviously is an extension of what we hear from people. And we probably then from there move into things like channels of communication and tools we can use. But I think, Brian, if I bring you in at this point, if that's okay, I think you've spotted a missing link in all of this. And maybe a good place to start today is to sort of talk about, what is this missing link in your perspective? What is AQ or Answer Intelligence? And why is it so important to leaders?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Let me introduce Answer Intelligence and give you an example, and then we can go from there. But my background's been in and out of academia. I did research on questions and published some academic papers on that. And when I was doing this research, I realized we know a lot less about answers. The question side, the 6WH questions, open and closed questions, sales and coaching methodologies are based on questions. So studied the answer side of the equation, published some academic research, wrote a book, and essentially the relevance of answer intelligence is the idea that we ask questions about things we don't know. Questions serve many functions, but essentially there's gaps. And when you provide an answer, you fill that gap. And that answer is influence. So just very broadly speaking, in an interview context, you can ask great questions, but it's the answers you provide that get you the job. In a sales context, you close the deal when you answer the proverbial question that's keeping the executive buyer up at night. So it's this idea that answers are important, and we've come up with this framework with 6 answers: story, metaphor, theory, concept, procedure, and action that map to different questions. And that's basically what answer intelligence is. It's the idea of increasing your influence with others.
So, Brian, why is it so important to have those 6 different types? Because I think, there's lots of conversation, I'll bring Gemma in a second, but Gemma's world of sales where, we talk a lot about stories and what really influences people. So, should we just be focusing on stories? But you've got a view that actually all these different 6 types of answers have a part to play. So how does that all fit together?
Yeah, you can think about this in sales or any context. I'll give you an example in leadership. Now imagine you're an emerging leader. You need to ask yourself some basic questions. What is leadership? Why is leadership important to me? How do I lead? Your person's reporting to you are going to ask you these questions. So you need commanding answers. So for example, what is leadership to me? I could define it as a concept. I could say it's inspiring people and holding people accountable. Okay, that's a definition. I could provide a metaphor and say leadership is 2 ropes. When they're separate, they're strong, but when they're braided together, they're stronger. That's how I lead. Each meeting, I inspire and hold people accountable. Now, it's these kind of answers that give you command, that help someone really understand what leadership is as opposed to some diffuse understanding. Now, you take that same approach towards any conversation and any type of answer. And just to double back to sales, of course, people know that stories are important. They connect to people emotionally, but sometimes we forget about metaphors. They're simpler, they're more concise, they're also emotional. These are different answers that relate to different questions, and we need all these answers to influence others.
And I suppose that links in, Brian, that, actually, if you're truly listening, going back to more traditional kind of effective communication, actually knowing what question you're answering. No point telling the story, which is answering a why question, if actually people want to know exactly what it is that you do or how you do it.
Exactly. So there's question recognition, listen for the question. Oh, that's a why question. Okay, story. Oh, they're implicitly or explicitly asking a how question. I need to give them a procedure or an action. So it's fairly simple, but this framework and this idea of answers is not in someone's uh, current understanding of how to communicate. So it's a gap.
I love it because I think it brings it all, makes it very, very conscious. I think there's this kind of sense that traditionally we listen deeply, we ask great questions, and the answer just kind of falls out. So, which I think where we typically tend to be. So, Gemma, from your perspective, I know you're fairly new to this AQ kind of subject, but just listening to Brian there and thinking about it, let's keep with the sales context for now before we widen the brief. Is there anything for you that kind of resonates there, or when you look back at in your career or the people that have worked for you, where maybe things could have been better, stronger if you'd have had this kind of range of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we spend, you know, perhaps now reflecting back, a disproportionate amount of time on the questions. You're so fixed on a question that sometimes because you're already thinking about the next question, you miss the opportunity. And I think from a sales perspective versus a leadership perspective, it's very different now. I find myself in this situation. If you're in sales, you're kind of, it would have been so helpful to have those triggers of, as you say, the how, and then how you respond to that and how you relate to that person and how you're going to make your answer resonate with them to lead on to something else. It would have been so helpful. And I think also then from a leadership, when you're leading a team of people that are very different and they respond very differently, and having the ability to use some of the tools, the metaphor will resonate more with some than others, the story, the procedure. You think of a cross-functional team, individually they're completely different people, so knowing how to use the model to really get the point across to that person who's going to pick it up and run with it, so valuable.
I think, Gemma, you've really landed on something that really resonated with me when I read Brian's book and I've started to study this. And Brian, maybe bring you back in here, is that we tend to have a style. So some people love telling stories. Some people, I'm married to somebody that just loves metaphors. But of course, we all kind of respond to different types of communication. Could you expand on that element of it and the style element? I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I can, and I can sort of touch on Jaqueline's world a little bit, sort of accounting and finance. In the book, there's an interview AQ chapter, and I coached one of my former students to get a job, and she applied for and got a job at a Big Four accounting firm, and they told her she was one of the best communicators they've ever seen, best candidates. Truth was, she was an outstanding candidate, and AQ, I think, helped her. But one of the things she did was something we call high AQ practice 4, answer with style. So you try to understand the style of the other person, and regardless of the questions being asked, at a higher base rate, you provide those type of answers. So if someone's relational and they like stories and metaphors, feed them that. If they're analytical, give them theories and concepts. If they're practical, give them procedures and actions. So she profiled the individuals she was communicating with, and that helped to ingratiate her with those persons. So that's sort of an example of what Gemma was just talking about, and I guess connecting a little bit to Jaqueline's world.
Yeah. So, Jaqueline, from your perspective, anything for you, as a marketeer and the marketing director at Henderson Loggie, anything for you that this resonates with, where you could see this being a much more useful way to engage a market, engage prospective clients, or even maybe just to get your brand out there in a more powerful way?
Yeah, I mean, there are probably two aspects of it. I think it really resonates with me, about that kind of profiling of people. And, in a kind of leadership role myself, I guess that's kind of been my default, is trying to profile people and then how I respond. So I've kind of just intuitively tried to develop that over the years. And but actually having a model is so powerful, because that's so helpful. It would fast track you to be able to do that without having to try and work it out from your intuition, from, just from what you've learned from others. So I think that, I think if I had had that model early on in my career, I think that would have been so helpful and so powerful to me as an individual.
Yeah.
But I think on the marketing and sales side, again, I think it could be really powerful for us, because what we do is a large part of our marketing is around obsessing over the questions that our clients ask, and also from a marketing perspective, we obsess over what answers are the best answers that we can provide to that question. Because we realised a few years ago that there's so many questions that effectively our sales team, our fee earners, were answering on a regular basis. Hundreds and maybe thousands of hours of fee earner time would be lost answering the same question over and over and over. And as a team, we have to try and capture that question that's been asked and the answer, and be able to use that as part of our marketing, so that people can understand what we do. They can get the answers to their questions much earlier on in the sales journey. But again, mapping it out, because I think part of what was really resonating with me is that, again, it's been a bit of a default. Okay, there's a how question, but we must have a process then. So that's how we are hearing that question is answered the best. But it's just been through a process of trial and error, as opposed to actually having a formula for it, which I think is extremely powerful.
Yeah, and Brian, you were going to come in on that.
Yeah, just echoing that. So 2 examples, one in sales, one in marketing. So if you're a sales organization, challenge yourself. Can you communicate your value proposition as 6 answers? Very simple exercise, and I've done this, and basically huge gaps, right? We have 1 or 2 stories, maybe nothing on metaphors. So that's one idea. Second, related to marketing, just did a project with a global pharma organization, and they developed personas for sales to use. But the last mile is conversations. The personas are only effective if you have the questions and answers to engage them in that last mile communication. So I totally agree with what Jaqueline's talking about here, that it's questions and answers. And I'll also say effective communicators are doing this. This just gives you a framework to sharpen if you're effective. And then if someone's not effective or less skilled than you are, it gives you a framework to really lean into and to upskill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just adding to that, Brian, because when Jaqueline was talking, I think a couple of things jumped out to me that you talk about in your book is taking a how question and answering it in 2 different ways. It's either emotional or very analytical. That can, if you're putting that answer out in 2 different, you're gonna kind of connect with different people more readily. And I think probably one more question for you, Brian, is if we're trying to reach out to people we don't know because we don't know who they are, and I think you may have answered this with your value proposition point. Is it okay to kind of almost put, cover all 6 answers as you put stuff out there on the basis that, something will resonate with everybody? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, you want to try to listen for the question someone's asking implicitly or explicitly. And then you can use meta language. Oh, would you like me to tell you a story? And they're going to say yes or no. And you can sort of follow their lead, or you follow and pick up. If you told a procedural answer to a how question and they gave you nonverbals like, they're wincing, or some, they didn't really connect, then that's probably not the right answer type. So it's not as difficult as you think to just sort of pick up on what people want. A little bit more difficult is in a large group setting. If you're in a large group, or say you're doing marketing and you can't necessarily know who's going to be reading something on your website, then you want to cover more answers. So typically in a larger group setting, you might want to sample across different answer types. You might have your emphasis maybe on story, but you still want to touch on them all to sort of connect to all those different individuals and all the different questions they may have.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you said there, I think really resonates. That this is a missing link. It still needs to be connected to good listening, deep listening, reading body language. You don't want to take this in isolation away from the traditional forms of communication?
Yeah, give you a tip. Going back to the 80s and 70s, sports psychology started to focus on, started to come to fore in sports. And imagine in tennis, the ball comes over the net. When it hits the ground, you say to yourself in your head, bounce. When it hits the racket, you say racket. And that's how you're mindful playing tennis. Do the same thing when you're communicating. Listen for a question, implicit or explicit, and say to yourself, that's a how question, and be ready to provide a procedure and action. And it's about actively listening, is being engaged with that conversation.
Fantastic. I think that's a great tip. And we need to start wrapping up today because we try and keep these quite bite-sized. But Gemma, can I just come back to you? More as a leader now, you're leading a fairly big organization now. How has this kind of changed the way you think about communication as a leader?
Yeah, to be fair, just want to offer a comment on the sales side as well, because it was something that I was thinking about, and then I'll come on to the leadership one if I may.
Sure.
I was thinking as you were talking, Brian, about in a group setting, and for me, this could be such an effective thing to use as a tag team together, because quite often in more traditional settings, somebody's leading and then the other colleagues reading the room, watching the body language, trying to get the next question ready, or funnel it in a certain way. And I was just sitting back thinking when you were talking about, imagine you were tag team with your partner. Typically bigger sales, high stake meetings involve multiple people across multiple functions. And it was just making me think that actually it would be so effective if your partner is reading the room, going procedural, I'll respond high. You get the time to take the moment to then get the answer ready. It could be so powerful, absolutely, in that sales environment. From a leadership point of view, it's a little bit what I mentioned earlier. I I think this will be very valuable because when you're trying to lead the functional heads, they're really different characters and they respond in such different ways. And, I genuinely do try with metaphors, and I don't think they're always the best, if I'm honest. But you do try because you assume that there's going to be that, people are going to relate to it and respond. But sometimes, particularly if you're dealing with somebody, maybe more operational, who's much more procedural, they sometimes don't always get it, do they? They don't respond in the way that you want them to. And if anything, they don't think you get it. And therefore, there's a little bit of, we're not kind of on the same journey here together. So I think we could really use this to tap into, the leaders, which in reality have to move in the same direction, but from a very different perspective,
Yeah,
from a very
I
different
think
role.
Yeah, because I think you're right. It's like that. You want rapport, don't you? And if you're misfiring on style, you don't get rapport, and that's probably another
Yeah,
bigger part of this conversation for another day. I loved your point though, around the sales tag team, because
yeah,
I know myself. I've got a colleague who's a great storyteller. And
yeah,
I've got someone else in our team who's a great metaphor person to actually say, look, you're the storyteller. So when that story question comes up, you need to jump in because you're going to nail that,
absolutely.
and I'll do the theory because I'm the boring one. Yeah, so I love that.
In a world where everybody has information at the touch of their hands, we have to be smarter. We have to find a way to move it forward faster.
Absolutely.
So it's quite exciting, I think.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay, well, we need to wrap up today, but maybe we'll just finish off just with from you, Brian. Maybe just a quick where can people start with AQ? Maybe Jaqueline, Gemma, maybe just one thing that you think for you're going to go away and do that you think will really accelerate your journey with AQ from a leadership perspective. Brian, maybe start with
Yeah.
you.
For more information, you can go to raiseyouraq.com. And I encourage you to take the free Explore AQ assessment. It's a short test to get your AQ score and a 10-page PDF report.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. Jaqueline, one thing for you that you think you could take and really
Yeah,
accelerate your leadership?
I mean, I think we can revisit all of our marketing material and look at it and thinking, are we actually answering this in the most effective way? And I think there's probably quite a bit of refinement that we could do on those to and maybe a little bit of a mixture, as you say. I think we could also do a bit of that A/B testing on a few things, and just to see what starts to resonate with different audiences. I think that would be really interesting. So yeah, I'm actually quite excited about this. This could be a really powerful tool for us.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Gemma, I'll give you the last word today.
I think for me, I would probably start with maybe introducing it to the sales team. I think it's refreshing to have something that it's refreshing to have something that clearly addresses a gap. We've spent so much time talking about open questions, leading questions, and all that, which is valuable stuff. But I'm thinking about your video. Are you ready for the answer when you're asked the question? The reality is sometimes the answers are not that good, and that's the problem, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, no point having no point getting the question if you don't know how to respond to it. Absolutely. Thanks, Gemma. Well, thank you. Because I'm not going to try and I think some really great points today. Sometimes I pull out one or two, I think, highlight threads, but I think there are many, many good threads in there today. But maybe what I'll say, having become a bit of a student of Brian's now, is that we've talked a bit about sales and leadership today, but there's some really great applications on this around coaching, around recruitment and interviewing that Brian mentioned. They're all in his book, so I would certainly recommend the book. It's a great read. But thank you again to all our guests. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, Brian. In our next episode, we are going to continue this conversation on highly effective communication. We're going to try and bust a few myths around the subject. But if you want more on this subject, as Brian said, jump on his website or pick up his book, or you can reach out to one of our knowledge partners, Lucid, who are one of the practitioners of AQ in the UK at lucid-group.com. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to Inside the Director's Circle.